All right, and we're back. We have with us today in studio for our first conversation CEO in the Ministry of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and Disaster Risk Management, Dr. Kenrick Williams. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to have you this morning. Let's just start by getting an update. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Been pretty busy over the last year with
Yeah.
this conglomerate of a ministry, but been doing pretty well.
I could imagine what did you expect when you first got the portfolio, when you were first told that your services being requested to be a part of this ministry, and after a year, do you feel as if this has met your expectations or if it has gone above and beyond that?
I made the comment to my team about 2 days ago or so when I was first asked to be a CEO and was pondering the idea. I said yes to being a CEO without realizing that there was the disaster risk portfolio as part
Yeah,
of this ministry. So the
yeah.
fire department,
Uh,
the Met Service, the NEMO, because I was largely thinking about the former Ministry of Forest, Fisheries, Environment. And so it was an interesting makeup, but I think it fits really well when you look at climate change and disaster risks, comprehensive disaster risk management. It really fits very well. And so the last year have been trying to make that function, trying to make that work and figuring out how that best functions. So it's been pretty interesting over the last year. It's been pretty busy, like I said, trying to get the team working in cohesion, trying to push that integration. And then myself, individually, appreciating the public service and the nuances of the public service.
mhm.
I usually talk with my colleagues that, you can't just bring private sector belief and approaches and just apply it to the public service because it's a beast unto its own. It's very different, and you really have to learn the nuances, and again, I think they're important opportunities for some of those lessons from the private sector, which you can apply to public sector. But you have to understand public sector management and what that entails and how that operates to try to help to drive it
No,
forward.
I don't want to age you, but you look pretty young, right? Um, how do you feel at your age the importance of your voice in such a high-profile role and the voice of others like yourself?
You know, I am very humbled for this opportunity. Marlene and I grew up in the youth sector.
Yeah.
We did a lot of work with UNICEF, the Children's Advisory Committee. I've been with the YMCA and a lot of this youth work and pushing for the voice of young people. Actually, last Saturday, I had a session with UNICEF and the Air Quality Champions, UNICEF and the NCFC. And I reflected on that experience of growing up within the different sectors and being given that voice to champion some of these critical issues. And again, I remain very humbled to then have this opportunity to push and drive some of the things that we think is important for Belize and can really make some impact for. I think for me, coming from Lakei, coming from Jasmine Street, that really, how to be that example, but also making decisions and being conscious of the impact for those people. I think that's what drives me, and that's what I try to keep myself grounded going
Yeah.
forward.
I think that's I'm glad you say that because that's one of the things I think that we on the ground don't see much or don't understand much the background behind the persons that lead in these ministries, the experiences you've had. You're saying you're from Belize City, you're from Southside Belize City, to be specific, came from humble beginnings, and now you're up there. Just I know it's a bit personal, but just speak a bit to how your experience as a Southside Belize City youth, how that impacts your decision making when it comes to the critical issues that affects those in your community.
I grew up in the south side, but my family is from Cayo. And so growing up, it's always been a mix of those things. I currently actually live in Santa Elena. Um, my family, my mom, sisters still live in Belize City on Jasmine Street,
Okay.
and so I get the duplicity, the complexity of both
Yes.
lives and both
Yeah.
experiences, and so it's trying to be real to those things. I sat while waiting for the interview. I went to Nazarene High School,
Oh,
graduated from
really?
Nazarene High School right across the street, and having some of those
All that
memories.
nostalgia
Yeah,
coming back now. Yeah.
all that nostalgia. But again, especially because it's that 1 year anniversary, I try to reflect on what is the real impact that I've had for
Yeah.
these people, and the decisions that I make and I support. How it affects the same people that the context, the experiences that I've had, and they're young people, for instance, who don't have the opportunity to go to high school. They're young people who, might just need a small bit of support to just get over, some of the thresholds to get them going and motivation and stuff like that. So I try to think about that a bit.
Yeah, I feel like we could keep with this conversation for the entire show because it's so important to
Yeah.
talk
Yes,
about.
yes.
People often see the end result, but they don't know the work that goes in
Definitely.
before.
Right.
And speaking of work that you've done before, you are no stranger to having worked within the environmental sector before you took on the role of CEO. And you worked in education as well. My question has to be, is looking at the goals that you had set out in entering the ministry, as someone who had a passion, especially for the environmental sector, and then the challenge of implementing it within the public sector or being able to align your vision with those of your ministers and the administration.
How much time do we have for,
Wow.
for that one?
How honest are you going to be with us? Go ahead.
But indeed, it's been complex. Coming in with this vision, as you indicated, I worked since coming back with my PhD, I've worked with the Biodiversity Finance Initiative as a policy advisor, policy expert with the ministry. And we did a lot of the assessments in terms of what were some of the challenges to address sort of the enabling environment, to address some of our environmental challenges, to look at the interrelationship between poverty and the implications for the environment, some of the national policies and the fact that they act as perverse incentives to deforestation and the drivers of deforestation and implications for biodiversity. So for example, a simple one is that we have a 1% tax on land that is not developed. That's a perverse incentive for deforestation, right? That's driving deforestation. So there's these kind of things that we've been looking at over time. And then, of course, the strategic opportunities, the opportunities for green bonds and blue bonds, new innovative financing that is founded in our environment but drives economic development, and that drives some of the socioeconomic development that we need. For too long, I mean, we have the best labs, I mean, we have the best environment, we have so much unique things, but we steer away from sort of those unique opportunities that exist for Belize. So it's been the opportunity to implement that. But as we indicate, the public service is nuanced in its own self, and that's made it very difficult in the sense that, I mean, even the role of the CEO, you find yourself pushing a lot of papers. You find a team who is not used to that independence where they get to make decisions. And so for many things they come, well, CEO, do I do this, or can I do that, or should I do that? I've had HODs who have said, CEO, you have to appreciate that we're not used to this. And I'm saying, yeah, but here goes the responsibility and the authority to execute, because I need to focus on the strategic implementation and the strategic direction.
But you can understand or appreciate, at least, given the history of issues we've seen within public service and infiltration of influence from ministers and politicians, why very often there's been kind of this dilution of what should be autonomy. Let's use the example of, I believe he's now left now, Mr. Alegria, and some of the challenges you were having within the Department of Environment there. Now, Dr. Williams, this has been, we had Minister Musa on yesterday. I told him Home Affairs kind of takes over the whole conversation. We forget about new growth. For the ministry that you work in, it is particularly looking at environmental issues. That's been the
Right.
number one conversation and spark for debate. Let's talk about some of the issues you found there about oversight, about proper accountability in doing due diligence, because that's the core if you're talking about sustainable development.
Right. Indeed, what we've seen is that a lot of the decisions were influence decisions, and a gap in the independence of these heads of department. The process seemed to apply very differently to different people. It does not seem that there were standard applications of the various processes. So it's trying to standardize some of those things. I don't say the influence is still not there. I'm saying that we have to manage those influence to ensure that at the end of the day, the outcomes that they're within the remit of the various legislations and policies. But it's how do we support like you spoke about, Mr. Allegria, and some of the challenges with respect to the development and the environmental clearance and stuff like that. How do we support development, but ensuring, again, that we address the critical social issues, environmental issues that ensure that, environmental compliance is clear, it's effective, and so that we're not just giving clearance because this one process, one stamp they have to get, in order to move forward. That's not an easy process. We're having a challenge with a developer right now and say, hey, this thing is taking too long, and I'm saying we have a dual role of, one, ensuring that this process is clear, it's fair to you as a developer, making sure that we're not dragging you on and edging you on for years. But in the flip side of that, the ministry and the DOE and the NEAC, they have to ensure that they satisfy those critical questions in terms of your environmental compliance and stuff like that. So it's been challenging, but again, what I find is some of the gaps is that there are no clear application of the process. There's no, a clear manual of how we apply some of these things, a clear
Or
framework.
it's not uniform.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
It's different based on each time the process unfolds.
Right.
So let's dig deeper into that one, because when you talk about looking, especially when you're talking about environmental impact, there are many different factors. I think you pointed out social and environmental, but fundamentally, your role is to find that sweet spot, that delicate balance between how do you promote development, but still ensure that the environment isn't critically damaged.
Right.
Let's talk about that process. What's the definition there that you'd use?
So the idea is that for these development projects, that the impacts are mitigatable, right? Particularly with respect to these large development projects. What we try to see is, can this project move forward, and you assess the scale, both the time scale and the size of those impacts, for instance, to see that, over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, those damages can be remediated, so that the development does not have then a more long-term an expanded impact.
So when you look at damages and you look at what needs to be mitigated, is there a threshold in terms of the extent of damage? When you look at some of these NGOs, their threshold is zero, limited.
Right.
How do you balance that, and is there a threshold there?
There is a threshold. Again, we have to find that this idea of sustainable development is finding the environmental impacts and ensuring that those are mitigatable, that those can be addressed over time. We have to look at the economic opportunities that comes from those investments, and how much we benefit, who benefits, and the benefits, again, similarly, over time, right? So you have to do that long-term cost-benefit analysis to ensure that if it is that we're going to be getting X amount of dollars, that impact is felt over time. And then, of course, the social impacts, right? How much does it impact community, how the local community, the broader Belizean community? What anthropogenic impacts, does it have on our identity or culture or specific groups of people? Those are some of the considerations that we have to look at comprehensively in order to look at clearance.
The conservationists that seek to protect and keep our environment, you see them, are they your enemies or partners in development? How do you view them?
definitely partners in development. They have a critical role to play. They have to. We have to appreciate their role in this whole process, and that's why they have to be part of the process, because they're able to advise clearly on the impact on biodiversity, the functionality of a system, specific species and the current status of those species. So for example, if it is that there's a specific tree species or a plant species or fish species that is going to be impacted and that species is critically endangered, then we have to consider that in the decision-making process. Yeah. But we also have to consider, again, the overall functionality of the system. Is this ecosystem, this specific ecosystem, its function being impacted? Can it be mitigated over time? What about the benefits then to Kikaker or Placencia or San Pedro, right? And those are things that we have to weigh with their information, as well as then the other information that we'd have to weigh that feeds into the broader decision making.
Yeah. So let's talk about, the administration just completed their investment summit. You just came back from COP. There's a big push towards attracting investors. Most investments will come with some kind of environmental clearance requirements. Are you seeing an increase in the number of interest in persons seeking clearance at this time?
We are. Actually, we're seeing projects that seem to have been stalled for a long while coming back to be reappraised and assessed for environmental clearance. We've certainly seen an increase in small development and medium-scale development projects, particularly in the tourism sectors, being revised or newly being.
And with the general goal of the administration to push for more investment, is there any pressure on the ministry to be able to either expedite or to maybe look at your processes to make it more investor friendly?
Yes, as a matter of fact, when we came in, I think just about February, we took our first cabinet paper to say, let's look at the whole NEAP process, the whole development framework. Now, where we stand is that this NEAP process is unduly burdened with too much. So the idea currently is that NEAP looks at environmental clearance, but it also, in the whole EIA process, there's a portion for economic analysis and economic assessments. There's a social impact analysis. Now, the NEAP is constituted to support environmental clearance, and so not all of these other. We have a representative from the Ministry of Finance, but we do not look at comprehensive economic analysis, financial analysis.
So they should only be focusing on environmental.
Right. So we are looking now, and there's a discussion ongoing with the various ministries, then how we could strengthen this broader process to ensure that when a project is given clearance, well, at least we look at the environmental clearance, and then the other ministries and sectors look at the social impact analysis, for example, the economic impact analysis, the financial forecast, and the other numbers, for example, so that we can strengthen our process, but that there's an overall comprehensive process that does a review for these development projects.
Yeah. So I guess this all sets the backdrop for the question you said you were anticipating about looking at the 3 port developments. And it has been debated in so many different ways, from environmental perspective, from social perspective, from economic perspective. What's the stance today? I know your minister's gone on record to say how he feels, but tell us if anything has changed at this point.
I think that's, in general, we're responsible for overall clearance of these projects as they come in. And again, what I think what is missing is this comprehensive analysis, this strategic environmental assessments, for example, that look strategically at all of these port developments and say, from an environmental perspective, because there could be assessments from a financial, from a port development, from a tourism perspective, again, all outside of the remit of what we should do. But for what we're responsible for, as the system stands, we do environmental impact assessments. All we do is to look at individual projects, their individual impacts, and we don't look at this thing from a more comprehensive analysis. So there's no strategic assessment of overall port development. I mean, without a strategic assessment, you know that there are going to be cumulative impacts from all of these port development. That's I mean,
Do you think it's too much?
Yes. Yes.
The developments?
yeah, when you look comprehensively, there will be cumulative impacts that we have to consider. No?
So how do you then seek to balance that? You're saying what I'm hearing you saying is that there's the question I asked, if there's too much development in terms of, we have 3 ports being built. We know that there are
Proposed.
concerns at this time. How do you then seek to ensure that, because these developments are already ongoing, are already taking place, that the impacts and the cumulative impacts, as you put it, are minimized?
That's a complex question just because of the way our system functions and works. And not to be a politician in this response,
Right,
but
right.
and I always try to be sensitive of that. But again, we are responsible for assessing individual projects and their impacts. And so it is unfair to a specific developer to say, well, you can't get because he get and she get. We have to look at your specific project, and that's the mandate of our department. No, what we need to influence is a broader policy decisions, and we can speak to, from an environmental perspective, listen, the cumulative impact of this is significant. So while we are looking at the individual environmental clearance, there has to be a broader discussion, policy discussion at the level of cabinet, at the level of the decision makers, to consider whether we want this type of comprehensive development, significant development within our waterways, especially because of the commitments that we're making. Otherwise,
Yeah. And when you, I mean, what about, all ministries are under-resourced, and that makes things even more difficult. But what about monitoring the implementation?
that's one of our biggest weakness, the
So-
monitoring and enforcement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can see where this poses a challenge, even if I get a clearance environmentally, but if I don't have anyone, and especially typically developments don't happen in the middle of where you have your office and all your resources set up. It takes additional to go out and see what's happening.
Yeah, that's an exciting question because of what we're trying to do to address that gap. First of all, we can't monitor everybody, but we can be strategic in how we monitor and enforce. So what we're looking at is sort of risk-based monitoring. There's 2 portions of it: the approach and then the personnel. Because, I mean, right now we have about 2 or 3 persons in enforcement to cover the country.
Oh, wow,
I
we're
mean, that's-
talking, this is including the development, support
Yes,
development, 2
yes.
persons.
2 or 3 persons that's specifically in the enforcement unit that supports development.
Yeah.
So what we have to do, we're looking at through some projects and other means to bring in the finance to bring on additional personnel, because we know that the public service is impossible right now to increase. So if we can be strategic through project funds, then we can beef up our enforcement unit to be able to get out there. And there's also some other financing opportunities through, for example, the EMF and the monitoring fee that these developers pay, that we're trying to capitalize some staffing to support that. But as I was saying, the approach also has to be, systematic,
Yeah.
and so we're looking at a more risk-based approach to the enforcement. Simply what we're doing is that we're establishing a framework for risk, looking at, where we need to prioritize in terms of environmental impacts, social impacts, and have our people target those. But we're also implementing a system where individual companies have to do their reporting, their annual assessment, and then from those we select and just do monitoring on those. Because right now there's no clear system on how we do that. We just, target those, particularly those we think are big ones, or they have more significant environmental impacts, but it's not in a targeted way. And that's why you will see sometimes for 2 years or 3 years, we don't do any monitoring.
Or that's when we get the citizen journalists that come out and say, hey, look what's happening
Right.
here. This isn't what was first announced.
Right.
I mean, we've seen it over the years happen so many times.
Right.
Very often from environmentalists as well. Dr. Williams, there's more we can talk about here, but I do want to shift gears just ever so slightly, because I know the environmental, the climate change conference just recently wrapped up, and Belize had great representation there. I think Prime Minister Briceño, in his comments, definitely created quite a buzz, and the signing of the Blue Bond. Let me hear about it from your perspective. Just what do you think are some of the strides made at this year's COP?
Well, we went out full force to show that Belize is a leader. I mean, when I talk to my people, I say, you know what, we're a leader. We just don't show it. We're just not there. We're just not part of the conversation. This year, COP, very importantly, we have to go out and show Belize's leadership in conservation-based climate action.
Yeah.
We've been doing this thing for a long time. We've been investing in mitigation. We've been applying unique nature-based solutions. When we look at our conservation approaches, we've been doing good. And so it's to scale up. So this year, we participated in more than 30 side events at COP. Belize hosted 3 side events, which was really amazing because, the participation was significant. And that gave us a lot of traction going forward, as you indicate. At the highest level of government, which we hadn't had in years, the Prime Minister participated in the World Leaders Summit. And again, he really laid the foundation for Belize's participation in this process and defending Belize's position. That's always very critical going forward, so that when us, the technicians, in the political negotiations, they know that Belize is going to be an important factor in the process. So we had to highlight Belize leadership, but we have to also be a part of the negotiations and scale up Belize's participation in negotiations. When you look at countries like Barbados and Trinidad, their people are actively engaged in the negotiations. That's important not just for the negotiations, but for being part of the conversation going forward. And that was important for us. So at this COP, Minister Habet led discussions on common time frames and reporting for nationally determined contributions. That has a lot of implications for when you treat with carbon markets, that have implications for reporting of your emission reductions, and so a critical part of the negotiations. But I also thought, and we also thought it was important that after COP, we are able to be part of the discussion and we're able to get our own carve out, if you will. And so we went for some important positions within the broader COP, within the UNFCCC, within the Adaptation Fund Board, and the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. So looking at unique opportunities so that, Belize could be part of the conversation after COP and make sure that, we're able to say, hey, there are opportunities that Belize could leverage, take advantage of, and benefit from.
Well, I think we opened this conversation with you speaking about the difference with public service versus private sector, and you know that the unions were very critical of the size of the delegation. And in a matter of full transparency, the media was also sponsored to attend the event. So this station attended in addition to other media companies. But let's talk about how, from your point of view, do you feel that that investment was worth it, and where did the money come from?
It was more than worth it, Marlene. It was more than worth it. I think for the first time, again, Belize, I've been part of this ministry for more than 5 years. I know they go to COP. I have no idea what they do. I know who represents who. I don't know what are the discussions, the impacts of those discussions on what we do in country. We thought it was important to change that this year. And so the delegation represented and reflected, when you look at the Ministry of Finance, from our ministry, again, from the time I joined this ministry, we've been saying a long time, it's important that finance is a part of the discussions, because the financial discussions have implications for the environment. The Ministry of Economic Development, which supports, the driving national development, addressing things like poverty alleviation and social protection. These things are not disconnected. The Ministry of the Attorney General, or the Attorney General's ministry, and the work that we're doing in terms of the carbon framework and the carbon legislation and climate change legislation. Again, that there's importance for participation there. And then, of course, the Ministry of the Blue Economy, or ministry. And again, this thing is layered in various levels. There's a World Leaders Summit, there's a political negotiations and discussions, and then there's a technical negotiations, which this year we had a strong showing of young technical negotiators. I think more than 10 of our young people from the ministry was part of the technical negotiation team. So indeed, we have had a comprehensive delegation that had participation at all levels. Was it all funded
by the public purse?
Not funded by the public purse. All of this were funded through partnerships with the IFIs, so Coalition for Rainforest Nation, the Taiwan government, the UNFCCC sponsors 3 persons. The I think the Kabe supported some of the delegation. So there are several funders who we look at and to support the whole delegation. No?
And while the representation in from Belize at COP was certainly visible, and as we said, we had a few breakout moments where where Belize captured the headlines.
Right.
I do want to talk about just overall the achievements that collectively, some would say, were not made at COP26. And that would be looking especially at the final declaration and how much the commitment is there now by all nations. Putting it all into perspective, I know we've said it many times, it simply means that those who are creating the problem and those who are feeling the impact of the problem, like us, must come to an agreement. How do you feel about the final results?
Disappointed. Disappointed. Certainly, that's not what we wanted. We wanted to see more real commitment. And we expected real commitment because of the realities that are experienced on the side of the developed countries and the pronunciation of the impacts of climate change on their side.
Yeah.
But in the end of the day, from my perspective, individual perspective, this is a financial position that these countries take, because at the end of the day, to say I will phase out coal have a financial implication. A country like Norway said, give us a transition period, because a significant portion of our people are employed in the oil sector. So we can't just, we need transition. What about us who,
How about Monkey River that loses
Exactly.
homes and cemeteries and everything in between?
Exactly.
Islands that are disappearing. But I questioned, and I think when we had the representative from 5Cs here, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and the pandemic has come with a great economic impact across the globe, not just Belize, but everywhere else. So it was almost a difficult time to negotiate when you're already feeling a pinch on your pocket. Do you feel that there is hope for commitment in the near future, or it will consistently be kick the can down the road?
I think as best as possible. I think as much as possible, these countries will kick that can down the road. I think they will make small incremental commitments. Whether they will realize those commitments or not is still to be seen. I am not hopeful that we will see the type of commitment that we need. Again, when you look at the commitment for the $100 billion, for example, only 20% of that $100 million was actually realized, and only 2% of that come to small island developing states. That's totally insignificant.
Which is why small island states, or those being impacted like us, have to have a very loud voice.
Right.
Collectively.
Right. And that has to happen, and we need to keep pushing for that. That's why Belize has to step up as a leader in this discussion, a leader in this process. The challenge this is also a political negotiation. Challenge is that, these developing countries leverage positions with their partners, even in or negotiating groups. And so while we collectively agree, when we get to the table, there's diversions from common opinion and common agreements. So that's a challenge. We need to continuously build, again, and find the carve-out for SIDS, the support for SIDS. So capitalizing of the adaptation fund, some of the discussions at this year's COP was things like share of proceeds, to increase the amount of finances that goes to the adaptation fund, therefore that goes to SIDS. To address some of those real serious critical problems.
So while we wait, what do we do? Because we know the issues on the ground are urgent and they're critical, and there isn't necessarily time, as science has shown, as the discussions have proven, for more waiting. Things need to be done.
Paul, well, while we take part in these regional and international processes, we have to make sure that we carve out for Belize the financing that we need. This thing is not an environmental discussion. For too long, we've been having this one-sided discussion about climate change. No, this is a discussion about poverty. This is a discussion about the communities that are being impacted. The impact on infrastructure, the impact on ecosystems. But at the end of the day, just like how Norway want a transition period and everybody want their carve out, we have to start having that discussion for Belize and, ensuring that we go and secure opportunities for Belize. And I think that's the difference, that we will share common positions. We will ensure that we negotiate and advocate for a regional opportunities. But again, even within our region, countries are ensuring that they look at financial opportunities that secure and protect their people. And that's what we have to continuously do as part of this discussion.
Does a part of your work include educating these communities that are being impacted on how to mitigate and address these impacts?
Yes, yeah, certainly. That's a part of our standard approach. I don't think that's a part of the impactful approach. The impactful approach is then integrating the Ministry of Infrastructure Development and Housing in this discussion, the Ministry of Health in this discussion, expanding, again, moving this thing away from a singular discipline of being a climate change issue to a national development issue.
Yeah.
I think we have to really scale this thing up. And that's what we try to do at this year's COP, change the narrative and change the approach.
Yeah. And as it becomes a broader, more a part of the global conversation, I think it starts to ring home here in Belize that we have been seeing the effects of climate change. We have been paying for some of the effects. I know we were talking about infrastructure following Eta and Iota,
Right.
the flooding that came from that. We've talked about droughts
Right.
in the agricultural sector, erosion, coral bleaching, the list goes on and on. So that's where, when we talk about, I know you brought it up earlier, the climate financing is important because we're paying for it.
Yes.
We're
Yes.
paying for the damage.
Yes. Yeah, so looking at the climate financing in terms of grant and the climate financing bucket or portfolio of money that exists, we have to be aggressive and go out there and get that. Again, not just for it seems that we've been looking only at the environmental impacts in the environmental sectors, and we've been targeting the small of $2 million and $3 million grant, which we do have trouble in even implementing those. But there are opportunities again for important infrastructure development that helps to address the adaptation side of climate change.
Yeah.
Supporting the infrastructure, supporting hurricane shelters and supporting rural communities, access to water, all of these things. We have to target those things. But then there's also the other side of the innovative financing approaches that exist. We've been protecting our forests for so many years. We've not explored carbon markets and the opportunity for credits and credit sales. That's one of the big push that we're now looking at.
But what's the delay there? Because we've been talking about the potential for carbon credits. The best thing about landing in Belize is when you see all this green.
Right.
And if we think about the idea of carbon credits, we're ideal.
Yes.
But this has been up for conversation for a long time.
Well, it's a new market, right? And so that new market is being developed. What has been the discussion at COP influences carbon markets, right? And it influences the framework for carbon markets. So what we have right now are voluntary markets, right? So for example, Program for Belize have a voluntary program. What the Paris Agreement outlines is a framework for that carbon market through RED+, right? How you assess and value the amount of carbon reductions or the implications for sustainable harvesting or mechanism, the protection of your forest. So there's several components of a carbon market, and then the market itself: who trades, who buys, how do we cancel, how do we serialize your credits from Belize, for example. So that market is now being finalized and set up through, but again, issues of how do we share proceeds, cancellation of that. What we don't want in this broader discussion at COP of climate change is that we don't just want carbon offsetting. So I sell to you because you're polluting. That does not help the overall climate change situation. So there needs to be some cancellation of some of those credits so that we retire those. So that goes to the savings, the overall global savings. But you, as the buyer, pays for that, and not the conservation people. But of course, now you want as much as you can as a developed country to capitalize. And so at COP, you're saying, I don't want no cancellation. I want all as much as I can get. you know. So those are the type of things that we keep negotiating. Anyways, I think we're at the point, at least for Belize, where we're formalizing a market,
Yeah.
and we're able to engage, whether through bilateral or through a market trading system, the sale of credits.
Well, we're running out of time very quickly. But I do want to talk, you said that you took your 1 year assessment and kind of looked at what you've been able to accomplish and some of the challenges as well. Let's dive into that. What are some of the milestones for the ministries over the past year?
I think setting up a lot of the foundations, looking at when you look at the staff and the human resource, that's for me one of the biggest challenge. When you look at a fire department, you had a motivated fire department, the lack of the resources that they needed to do what they needed to do. When you look at, we discussed the development framework earlier and projects and how the DOE, for example, treat with the review process, just putting in some of those basic processes to, hey, what do you do when Marlene submits a project, and how do you go through that process? And when you submit a project, and how, to ensure that there's a standardized process to do that. So it's really building a lot of those framework, putting in the protected areas sector, putting in a co-management framework so that there's a partnership agreement between the government and the private sector, and that there's a reporting mechanism in place so that we know the impact of your role in this broader system, looking at the broader national protected areas system and some of the gaps that we've had there with the legislation, and earlier attempts to try to consolidate the system.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is sort of working on those, putting in those background work too. Because you come in and you say, okay, we want to strategically implement these things, then you realize, well, my
There's no
human
structure.
resources not there, the system not there, and so you spend a lot of time just doing
Building.
Right.
But moving forward, though, with the signing of the Blue Bond, you're looking at an increase in marine reserves, but more work, really,
Yes.
on your shoulders. So wouldn't it then come naturally that there'd be additional resources allocated? You talked of an enforcement unit of 3 people. So I know you outlined ways that you're hoping to work on that, but there really isn't, as I said before, we've only been able to touch on sustainable development, minimally on climate change. Disaster risk is a huge element as well.
Right.
So as the work increases, as we talk about being this shining star in sustainable development and conservation, the load then increases with your ministry.
It sure does. But I think we can be strategic in how we treat with it. A lot of the work that the CEO has to do has to be strategic. We need to build again, we talked earlier about the HODs, the heads of department, taking on those responsibility and authority for making decisions. And you have to trust in them to be able to do that. You review, you revise, you strengthen. And we put in the right policy people to help to drive some of the direction, the decision making of the ministry. I mean, as part of the outcomes of COP, I was nominated to the Adaptation Fund board, again, finding out of those strategic, supporting those strategic objectives of the ministry and therefore of the government. So it's really to ensure that we've again put in the necessary systems in place. That's of course easier said than done, but putting in the necessary systems in place to make this thing function as best as possible without the direct hand of a CEO.
All right. And anything coming in the near future that you are looking forward to?
Well, we have next coming up the United Nations Environmental Assembly. Again, very important for our work in terms of plastics and the single-use ban, all the work that we've been doing with the Department of Environment, trying to strengthen that system. Again, we came in and said, let's look at single-use, banning of single-use plastic and styrofoam and stuff like that. But there's a broader process that we need to put in place. We've been actively engaged in some of the marine pollution litter and the implications of those things. But the broader idea here is to again, scale up Belize's role at the international level and say, listen, we've been doing these things, we've been putting in the legislation, in some cases with some implications to our people. And so we need to ensure that we're securing the right financing then to support people, to support jobs, to support, some of the other issues.
All right.
Well, with that, Dr. Williams, we want to thank you for joining us this morning. Such an insightful discussion.
Thanks very much for having me, and I look forward to this journey and sharing it, with Belizean people, because it's not easy, and so we want them to understand this process and the work that we're doing. I think which will be important is sort of two-sided communication and opening those opportunities for people's input and involvement in the process.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we have in studios with us Miss Earth 2021, Miss Belize, Destiny Wagner. Stay tuned.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.